public session, and we're on item 5 of the agenda, which is engagement with stakeholders on the progression by members of the travelling community to second level and third level education. So the purpose of this meeting is to have an engagement in relation to this topic, as I mentioned. So on behalf of the committee, I wish to welcome Mr Bernard Joyce from the Irish Traveller Movement, Ms Elva O'Callaghan from the Yellow Flag Programme, Mr Martin Collins from Pave Point, Ms Maria Joyce from the National Traveller Women's Forum, Mr Clive Byrne from the National Association of Principals and Deputy Principals, Mr Fergal Brome from the INTO, Ms Nessa White from the Education and Training Boards of Ireland. You're all very welcome. And following that session, we're going to have Ian McDonough, who is a student and who did work experience here, actually was one of the TDs, and met him a few months ago. So he's going to talk to us about his experience as a traveller student. So thank you for that. So the format of this part of the meeting is that I will invite you to make a brief opening statement, a maximum of 3 minutes. We have a number of groups, so I really would appreciate if everybody could stick to that time. And that will be followed by members of the committee. All of the members will have an opportunity to raise questions or make comments, and you will have the chance to come back. Just to say in advance, I know that Deputy Martin has another commitment in the chamber, so she will have to leave and won't have the opportunity to engage, but she's asked me to point that out. Yes, Deputy Byrne.
Questions as well at some point, so I'll be leaving at some point and coming back, so
okay.
Apologies if I do or miss someone's
Thank you.
reply or whatever.
Thank you for that. So before we begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by myself as chairperson to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. And you are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter that we have today is to be given, and to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. And I also wish to advise you that any opening statements that you may make today will be published on the committee's website following the meeting. And members, I want to remind you also of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that you should not comment on, criticise or make any charges against any person outside the House or any official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. And can I please remind everybody to turn their mobile phones off, please, because when they're on, they do interfere with the recording equipment, which is difficult both for parliamentary reporters and indeed for those who may be watching the proceedings at home on their laptops or on television. So, to get going, I'm going to ask Mr Bernard Joyce from the Irish Traveller Movement to please make the opening statement.
Firstly, I just want to thank the committee for giving me the opportunity to present to the joint Oireachtas committee on education and skills. But maybe just briefly, just to say just about the Irish Traveller Movement. The Irish Traveller Movement was founded in 1990. It's a national-based traveller-led organisation representing our members. One of the core values and principles is to challenge racism that travellers face in Ireland today. Just in terms of the historical context, and I think it's a really important point to be made here, and I want to draw the committee's attention to, is the experience of travellers within the state education system, not commonly known to the wider community, is the importance of the awareness of the historical experience of traveller population in terms of fundamental to the rights and wrongs of the past, and instilling confidence going forward into the future. I suppose from the 70s right up to the present day, there were segregated education schools in Ireland. Children were educated in only traveller-only schools and only traveller classes, and that was right up from the 70s right up to 2000. I suppose from this point, traveller segregation began to be phased out, and many travellers today recall horrific stories of being washed when they came into school, and also in terms of having separate playtimes. They were also given, having lunch separate from their peers, and the expectations by their teachers was extremely poor. Many were left to draw pictures, play, and in fact, many today are unable to read and write. Those experiences still influence traveller parents who engage within the education system. I suppose as well as respond to their own children's experience of today, racism and bullying within schools. In January 2017, the Department of Justice and Equality commissioned Economic Social Research, a report called Social Portrait of Travellers in Ireland, found that travellers experience an extreme disadvantage in terms of employment, housing, health, and face exceptionally strong levels of prejudice. The gap between traveller participation and retention in education has worsened compared to their settled counterparts, and I refer to this further. Unfortunately, in 2011, traveller Pacific education supports were also cut by 87%. These included the withdrawals of the visiting teacher service, resource teachers, in terms of primary schools, and also in terms of allocation of hours in second level education, and enhanced capitation for primary and secondary level. These cuts were made at a time of high retention of traveller pupils from primary to post-primary in state education. And in fact, those cuts disseminated the support infrastructure for traveller education and had a detrimental impact on traveller education progress today. I also want to bring your attention to reduced timetables, which is a real concern. And obviously some members may be aware of it, some members may not. But the Irish Traveller Movement has been raising this issue along with other organisations about a practice of reduced timetables. In many instances, it is the parents who are now monitoring and reporting to traveller organisations, and in turn who have brought these concerns to various ministers. We are concerned that in certain areas, no schools, or conversely one school, is actively supporting the inclusion of travellers. I suppose this school then informally becomes the school in the area that travellers are directed to and become seen as the traveller school. Traveller children and their peers are denied the opportunity to learn about travellers within the education curriculum. And there was also an opportunity in terms of Senator Colette Kelly's private member bill on the inclusion of traveller history and culture within mainstream curriculum. And we understand that has both government support and cross-party support and community support. I suppose the Irish Traveller Movement is very concerned about we're very concerned about the practice in terms of reduced timetables across the country. And we know that from parents who are reporting to us that these concerns, but there's no monitoring practice by TUSLA or the Department of Education and Skills. And instead, the responsibility now is placed on parents to take a complaint by Section 29 of the Education Act. And I suppose what we're saying is that needs to be addressed. In conclusion, the majority of schools have systematically failed to recognise, I suppose, travellers and traveller culture, and their way of life is invisible right across the school setting. As a result, non-traveller children are denied the opportunity to learn about traveller culture in a positive learning environment and increase the chances of their views being informed by negative stereotype views of travellers that persist in wider society. So we look forward to exploring other matters today that we have raised in our submission for traveller children in progression within education. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bernard. And now we move on to Elva O'Callaghan, who's the coordinator of the Yellow Flag Programme. Thank you.
Chairperson, Deputies and Senators, thanks very much for the opportunity to address you this afternoon. I'm the coordinator of the Yellow Flag programme, which is the 8-step innovative whole school initiative supporting schools to promote inclusion, challenge racism and celebrate diversity. The Yellow Flag guides schools to communicate the values of equality, inclusion and support staff to access training on equality and diversity. We ask them to survey students and parents' current experiences of schools and to develop action plans to put in place curricular and extracurricular activities that promote interculturalism. Schools must also develop a whole school diversity code and review and improve their policies to ensure that an inclusive, respectful environment and robust mechanisms are in place to address and tackle racism. Schools must then present documented evidence of their work, which is assessed by an external panel on completion to determine achievement of a yellow flag. The Yellow Flag is an initiative of the Irish Traveller Movement, given the long-term evidence derived from its members, Byrne has alluded to, of the negative experience of travellers within the education system and the need for schools-based solutions. Issues such as conscious and unconscious bias, exclusion on the basis of identity or historical prejudice and absence of travellers in teaching and school management, institutional racism and poor awareness or knowledge about traveller culture have a highly detrimental effect on young people's education and learning, but also on their sense of identity and self-belief. What informs the programme and the practical approach that it takes is the recognition of the attitudes, policies and practices within school and how they influence daily life and the essential role they play in building positive educational environments, in addition to the adoption of national intercultural and anti-racism policy and regulations. Traveller students continue to face discrimination in schools, and we see that manifesting in many hiding their identity, changing their accent for fear of being bullied or being treated less favourably by teaching staff and their fellow students. An anti-bullying education programme, not just guidelines, should be introduced in every school, we recommend. Reports of discrimination in education settings are still evident to us, ranging from name-calling, physical assault, to social exclusion and institutional practices which reduce traveller student timetables or segregate them from other students. These are frequently reported to the Irish Traveller Movement. Even with all the resources that the Yellow Flag can offer, it can be hard to challenge discrimination amongst teachers and school managers, which can be either conscious or sometimes unconscious, or based on hidden biases. Mandatory anti-racist and intercultural training or continuous professional development for teaching staff has been proposed in a number of statutory policies but is not available in practice. The Irish Traveller Movement is very conscious of the need to expand the Yellow Flag and to strengthen the impact it can have on the education system in Ireland. It is important to note that there is no other programme like the Yellow Flag currently operating in the country. We have worked with 88 schools across 13 counties, reaching over 30,000 students and in excess of 2,500 teachers. However, to date there has been no investment by the Department of Education and Skills or by the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, both who have commensurate aims across a range of objectives and policies with our own. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
That's great. Thank you, Alva. And now I'm moving on to Martin Collins, who's co-director of Pave Point.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, Deputies and Senators. On behalf of Pave Point Traveller and Roma Centre, really do appreciate this opportunity to speak to you here today about the challenges facing travellers in the education system. Pave Point Traveller and Roma Centre has given central importance to pursuing full and equal participation of travellers throughout the education system since our very inception in 1985. This was and is based on our understanding of education's key importance for human dignity and rights. In fact, it was previously part of our name, Dublin Travellers Education and Development Group. Our work more recently expanded to include Roma, and this has significantly enhanced our work. And later, I hope at some stage in the future, we may come back to talk about the very specific experiences of Roma within the education system. The context is that these are challenging times globally for all of us concerned with rights and equality as we remember the terrible tragedy in Christchurch in New Zealand this month, and indeed the ongoing racism and exclusion in Ireland. The direct provision centres in Ruski being burned, the house in Clonmel allocated to a traveller family being vandalised, and this all points or demonstrates the need for a new national action plan against racism. However, it is also a time of opportunity here for travellers, with the recent recognition of traveller ethnicity by the Taoiseach and the Dáil in 2007. We also have the formal adoption of the National Travel and Roma Inclusion Strategy, which sets an agenda including the crucial area of education, but its aims have yet to be realised, and urgent attention is needed to ensure its full implementation. The disadvantage and poor educational outcomes for travellers have been well documented. We know that 13% of travellers complete secondary education compared to 92% in the majority population. We know that 7 out of traveller children live in families where the mother has neither no formal education or primary education only. We also know from the National Action Plan on access to higher education, which has set a target of having 80 travellers in third level education by the end of 2019. To date, we know this has risen from 35 to 61, 26 additional travellers. This points to the fact that we need to intensify our efforts in this regard, but it also demonstrates that targeted interventions and targeted resources are effective and does work. And we also know this from the Royal College of Surgeons, where they have an affirmative action programme where a number of travellers have the opportunity to study medicine and to become doctors. In terms of recommendations, overall we need to create a more inclusive learning context that promotes respect for diversity, interculturalism and addresses racism both at the individual and at the structural and institutional level. And we would like to make a number of recommendations in this area. All educational personnel, including policymakers, need to receive training in interculturalism, anti-racism, with an explicit focus on travellers. For far too long, there has been a culture of low expectations among teachers and principals in relation to travellers. This means that many travellers have missed out on achieving their full potential and their goals in life. In this context, we welcome the amendment to the Education Act currently going through the Dáil, which proposes that traveller culture and history will be reflected in the school curriculum. The Department of Education and Skills Integration Strategy 2017 does provide basic principles for inclusion, but we also need respect for cultural identity as well as social and economic inclusion. The proposed amendment will require concrete programmes and materials for schools on traveller history and culture, and we believe this is a fundamental step in the right direction, and it's only a first step, as we need to include other cultures and other identities in the school curriculum. Now that we are post-recession, we'd like to see the restoration of the support services for travellers attending schools. These services were savagely cut to the tune of 87%, as Byrne has already outlined. Direct and targeted resources are needed to promote traveller inclusion in mainstream education. One size does not fit all. Another important action in NITRIS is to promote affirmative action opportunities to support travellers who want to become teachers. And this is essential in promoting positive role models as well as influencing the culture and the ethos of the school. Direct engagement with traveller organisations as equal and key partners within the educational system and developing policy in relation to same is absolutely essential. We have worked with the Department of Education in the development of the traveller education strategy. We don't currently know the status of this strategy. We also need the re-establishment of the Traveller Education Consultative Forum or something equivalent, as we do not have a forum at the moment to feed into policy development in relation to education for travellers. We know the issues the community face. We know what works. In conclusion, we can't deal with traveller education in isolation from poor living conditions, high unemployment, low health status, exclusion and racism. What's required is a multifaceted approach. NITRIS, the National Travel and Roma Inclusion Strategy, is designed just to do that, but its recommendations and implementation plans have yet to be fully implemented. And we fully support the need for targeted special measures. Mainstreaming on its own will not work. We need targeted special measures to complement the inclusion and participation of travellers in the mainstream. And I'd like to finish with a quote, if you don't mind, Chairperson. It's from Sonia Sotomayor, the first Hispanic woman to be appointed Associate Justice of the Supreme Court in the States. And she goes on to say, until we get equality in education, we won't have equality in society. And I think that's very true. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Martin, and thanks for sharing that quote. I think it's something that we would all agree with. And now I'm going to ask Maria Joyce, who's the coordinator of the National Traveller Women's Forum, to address us.
Thank you. I also would like to thank the committee members and welcome the opportunity to highlight the issues and the experiences of travellers in education today. Very briefly, the National Traveller Women's Forum is a national network of traveller women and traveller women organisations from throughout Ireland, and we recognise the particular oppression of traveller women and the particular racism experienced by traveller women in Irish society. There are stark inequalities between traveller girls and women and the general population in participation, attendance and attainment in education. This has wider human rights consequences by exposing traveller girls and women to low educational attainment, future unemployment, poverty and social exclusion. The two key barriers in terms of traveller women and girls in relation to education is racism and lack of implementation of positive policy developments. I won't name them all as they have been identified in previous speakers, but we have policies, we have actions. We are not seeing implementation and we are not seeing monitoring. While this committee's role is to examine the progression of travellers through second level and third level education, it cannot do that in isolation of the very negative experience of many traveller children in primary school today, not just in a historical context. In the classrooms today, there is an absence of positive visibility of traveller culture in the curricula and the whole school environment. Bullying and racism experienced by traveller learners from their settled peers and also from educators. Discriminatory practices are still evident. Enrolment processes which exclude traveller children and, as has already been said, the growing numbers of traveller children being placed on shortened and reduced timetables inappropriately. This does significantly impact on traveller children's opportunities and experience in terms of educational outcomes. We've also got incredibly low expectations of traveller learners, and we have less than 100% transfer rates from primary to second level. Given that it's illegal, that's an incredible, statement to be making. Many traveller children completing 8 years of primary school and even into secondary school do not know how to read and write. We do know, based on the data we have, and limited and all as it is, that 7 out of 10 traveller children live in families where the mother has either no formal education or primary education only, based on the 2016 census. The census also shows only 13% of travellers complete secondary education in comparison to 92% of the general population. It is essential that traveller girls are supported through primary and secondary school to ensure opportunities at third level are taken up, as they are the future mothers and role models who will influence and shape their children's education. Less than 1% of travellers are in third level education. It would take 5 times more traveller women than settled women to have an equivalent basic degree. The attainment and retention of traveller students in second level education should be a very, very serious concern and consideration for this committee. In terms of way forward, proactive initiatives and programmes are needed to support traveller teachers within the education system. And we do welcome the recent scholarship that was put in place to support this, but it is tiny and there's a huge amount to be done in it. We need to ensure, and that kind of targeted initiatives is also identified, as Martin highlighted, in NITRIS, but we need to see implementation of that. We need to see prioritising of it. We need traveller children within the school system to be able to look at teachers who are the same as them, to be able to look at a curricula where they're reflected and not just the wider settled society. We need to ensure discriminatory practice in schools, which has already been identified, is swiftly brought to an end, because it is too drawn out in terms of how this gets addressed and doesn't happen. An implementation plan must be developed for all 14 actions under the National Traveller Roma Inclusion Strategy, in a real and equal partnership with traveller organisations. And outstanding recommendations from the Education Strategy in 2006 should also be addressed in a similar manner. The reality is that we have policies. We are not seeing action and we are not seeing implementation. And one of the key reasons for that is racism and the institutional racism that has been spoken about. Compulsory anti-racism and intercultural training is required for all teachers as part of their pre-service, but also as continuous in-service. This should not be an add-on, it should be core to training and that visibility of traveller in the curricula. Appropriate, desegregated data collection needs to be prioritised within the education system. The analysis from this data collection is needed to ensure targets and actions are having an impact for traveller women and girls in education, and to put in place the necessary appropriate targeted initiatives. There is currently a data collection within the education system. We're not seeing the stats and the figures from that. We need adequate resources. As has already been said, there's been a huge cuts right across education. And when you compound that with the huge cuts across all areas of traveller life in terms of accommodation, in terms of health, yeah, I'm almost finished. We need to see those other practical supports for uniforms, books, lunches. We need to see programmes like SciCap and education training boards meeting their targets. They're not. The Higher Education Authority need to set ambitious targets for travellers' access and third-level education with a range of supports to ensure this. And finally, third-level institutions must build on the knowledge that they are developing in their current work with travellers. They are beginning to identify and support traveller learners back into education, but this must also apply, they must also apply that learning in developing stronger links to the community to ensure collective and sustainable outcomes for travellers in third-level education. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. And now I'm going to ask Clive Byrne, who's Director of the National Association of Principals and Deputy Principals, to address us.
Thanks, Chair. A few brief points by way of opening. The National Association of Principals and Deputies is the professional association for second-level school leaders. We would have been on record in the past of promoting the concept of school leadership to foster a climate of tolerance in the school. And it would be NAPD policy that there would be inclusive admission policies and school policies. And we would very much be in support of the Yellow Flag initiative, and we serve on the steering group for that with representatives from our own national executive. We think it's really important that there should be ways found to cut down on the experience of discrimination which travellers feel when they are in school. And this is not only bullying and name-calling from students, but also we have to recognise the fact that we do have, amongst many of the staff, unconscious biases that could be reflected in low expectations of many of the traveller children in our schools. We need, I think, to put in place supports for parents, and colleagues earlier on have mentioned the fact, and we know in second level the importance of mothers in educational outcomes for their children, but we need to put in place appropriate supports for parents that they can see the value of education and continued education for their children. And in second level schools, we would feel that it would be vital to have good homeschool links between the school, recognising the context and the climate of the school itself, but also of the traveller children attending the school. We feel it's vital that the importance of attendance in encouraging achievement in projection and progression is highlighted. And from the point of view of the education offering that we give in schools, it's important that students, all school students, including traveller students, would experience appropriate curriculum and pathways and the background to put in place appropriate pathways for the progression of the traveller students. We would feel in the National Association and have articulated that we have too many schools at second level in our system and too many primary schools. And if the schools, many of the schools were amalgamated, it would be possible to have different subject choices and different programmes that could be included in terms of the arts, music, the Junior Cycle for Schools programme and Leaving Certificate applied. Could be offered in more schools to meet particular needs of students, because the experience of colleagues, as expressed to me in preparing for this briefing today, is that students at primary school seem to get on very, very well in terms of inclusion and all other aspects until 5th class, and then issues begin to arise which can cause literacy and numeracy problems as the students go into first year and second year at post-primary schools. The schools, of course, are expected to cope with issues of accommodation, mental health, access to supports to prevent suicide, and we have to recognise the reality of high levels of unemployment amongst the sector. And it is difficult for schools to be able to do this on their own. So the association would call for the restoration of supports for mainstream schools, that funding which had been cut in the past would be made available to schools, because there is an economic reality for parents trying to send their traveller children to schools, particularly in terms of the new initiatives that exist at the moment. Many of the students live in areas where there isn't access to broadband, there isn't access to some of the technology that is regularly used in schools at the moment. The disadvantages caused to traveller children in second level by not having resource teacher or visiting teacher for travellers. Travellers attend all schools, not just DESH schools, so in many instances the lack of access to homeschool liaison, I think, is very important, because if there can be good links between the home and the school, I think that will go a long way to resolving some of the issues. And certainly supports from the Welfare Service and TUSLA would be important. It's important from an attendance point of view that perhaps schools shouldn't have to wait the minimum of 20 days absences before making an announcement or a report to TUSLA that could be followed up by the welfare officer. And I think I look forward to exploring some of the other points made in my submission, but these would be key points that I feel should be emphasised at this part. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Clive. And I now move to Fergal Broom, Vice President of the ITO.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair. The INTO, that's the Trade Union for Primary School Teachers, thanks the committee for allowing me to speak here this afternoon. As stated already, the austerity measures imposed in 2011 led to a substantial reduction in investment in traveller education. As stated already, almost 87% cuts in total happened during that period. There can be no overstatement of the effect that this has had upon our traveller citizens in our schools. Education cuts have a particularly significant impact on travellers, where participation in education has traditionally been fragile. In particular, the experience and knowledge that resides in VTTs, that's the visiting teachers for travellers, there would have been about 40 of them, and they would have spent a lot of time going and communicating with parents, going to different houses of the pupils. So that was lost to the system. And RTTs, resource teachers for travellers, about almost 400 of them, services have been noticeably lost to the system. The visiting teachers offered a specific skill set and had developed an in-depth understanding of the travelling communities and their culture, and provided a valuable liaison between traveller families and schools in developing relationships and advocacy support. Responding adequately to the particular needs of traveller pupils continues to concern both teachers in DESH and non-DESH schools. We have to remember that 50% of the travelling community don't attend DESH schools. So the Department of Education would state that the homeschool liaison teacher was able to absorb this work, where of course that is not true. Homeschool liaison teachers are not able to in non-DESH schools, not available in non-DESH schools, and they are not available in rural DESH schools either. Given that only approximately half the travel pupil population attends DESH schools, there is an obvious discrepancy in the system. Moreover, the homeschool liaison teacher does not currently have the capacity to fulfil the duties previously held by the visiting teachers. It is widely acknowledged that traveller enrolment in education declines as pupils move through the system. A provision of specific supports and additional resources must be made available to travellers across the continuum of education from preschool right up to and including third level, to ensure that they have the opportunity to participate in our education system on equal terms with the rest of our peers. As stated already, wouldn't it be wonderful to see primary school teachers from the travelling community teaching and reflecting the curriculum in the schools? Huge disparities remain in the education attainment of travellers and a settled population, fork in 2006. The expectation that a school's special education team would be able to fully compensate for the loss of the RTTs is also completely unrealistic. The needs of travellers' pupils must be clearly reflected in schools' educational profile, which now determines schools' allocation of additional teachers to support special and additional educational needs. There continues to be many barriers for travellers in education, particularly around attendance, retention and completion. The additional target support offered by the VTT and RTE service had a positive impact on travellers in terms of these key challenges, particularly in primary school. In 2011, there was confirmation of improved education enrolment, with 100% of travellers being enrolled in primary education. We doubt if that's the case today. Anecdotally, there are reports that this result has declined significantly. There is a need for clear, robust, independent research on the outcomes for travellers in education following the withdrawal of traveller-specific support and the implementation of the Traveller Education Strategy. The INTO notes that the recent announcement by the EWS at TUSLA to pilot a project with the aim of improving the inclusion of travellers in education. While the move to develop a pilot project is welcome, there still remains the need for an immediate response to fill the gap left following the withdrawal of traveller specifics across the system. Anecdotally, a colleague of mine who works in a deaf school said that the cuts since 2011, it'll take at least a generation to undo the damage done by the cuts. So, in conclusion, we thank you for allowing us to speak here today.
Thank you very much, Fergal. And our final speaker on this first round is Nessa White, who's the General Secretary of the ETBI. Over to you, Nessa.
Thank you, Chair. Afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to address the committee today. I'm very pleased to make this statement on behalf of Education and Training Boards Ireland and the 16 ETBs that we represent. As much of what is included in the submission has been covered by previous speakers, I will be brief. So our response was submitted in two separate parts. One was the progression to second level education, and the second part was to look at the progression to third level. So for our sector, this took further education and training in that context. So ETBs are statutory authorities which have responsibility for education and training youth work and a range of other statutory functions. We manage community national schools, second level schools, further education colleges and a range of adult and further education centres in communities throughout Ireland. So when we looked at the progression and in preparation for today, there is evidence that members of the travelling community have access to a range of further education programmes within our ETB, and they are a priority target group in programme planning. In evaluating the progression, it is noted that there are high levels of participation recorded within Youth Reach provision. Youth Reach is a programme that caters for young people over the age of 16 who drop out of mainstream education. The challenge of literacy and participation has been mentioned previously. Despite the levels being frequently cited as low within the community, participation of the traveller community in literacy and numeracy programmes remains a challenge. Many of the other programmes delivered across ETBs across the country, like Back to Education initiatives, Skills for Work and apprenticeship programmes, all aimed at supporting adults who have low education attainment and who wish to progress further or develop personally, are still challenged with low participation rates from our traveller community. However, in some of our community education programmes that are delivered based on the requirements of the community, we see strong and positive engagement in programmes like Men's Shed, Women's Shed and other areas in the community that identify a need. When we look at second level education, Education and Training Boards have a long-standing tradition of supporting the educational development of members of the traveller community. As state schools, ETB schools are open to all pupils, regardless of any aspect of their identity. Our school cultures are underpinned by the core values of excellence, care, equality, community and multi-denominational. However, today, as always in an opportunity in this setting, is a day for me to learn and be reminded. So the ongoing research and as evidence today provides more evidence that the engagement with the parents is crucial for things to change. As mentioned earlier, traveller parents, their own negative experience of schools and their possible low educational attainment are key influencers in determining the progress of their own children. The links between home and school are crucial. Again, when we look at the barriers to participation in further education, as cited in a Solace report in 2017, low confidence and self-esteem, negative experience of education, childcare, transport, loss of reduction in benefits, suitability of courses and lack of awareness of what's available are all barriers, many of which could be also identified as barriers in post-primary. The Action Plan for Education and many of government policy documents outline the targets that we are set to achieve, but as mentioned earlier, some of those targets aren't being met. So in conclusion, while the participation of the traveller community is low in some areas as referenced above, continued engagement with Solace, the Department of Education and key stakeholders, like I've had the opportunity to meet some of here today, will look at how we can improve this. Many of the items mentioned, consideration to the provision of an allowance on a pilot basis to those programmes that don't currently attract an allowance could be considered. Interventions being put in place at an early stage of education and on a continuum to encourage ongoing participation with education could be considered. Clarity around the retention of DEASP and other benefits is on occasion a barrier to is a reason for non-participation. Schools need support in identifying and accessing the services and resources beyond those provided by the Department of Education, and a mapping exercise could be conducted in this regard. As mentioned earlier, on a number of occasions, training programmes, CPD on an ongoing basis for teachers is a requirement. The reintroduction of a repurposed support officer for traveller service should be considered where the links between home and schools are strengthened. A framework to encourage schools, FET colleges and centres to evaluate and measure their current practice of engaging and supporting students is something we certainly could consider. A system for tracking the pupils from primary to post-primary and on to further and higher education should be developed. A review of childcare provision to support the traveller community in accessing education and addressing the challenge of transport costs, as mentioned, in terms of rural provision and access. So thank you for the opportunity to engage, to listen and to learn this afternoon.
Thank you, Nessa, and I think it was very interesting. There was a lot of very practical recommendations from all of our stakeholders. I think that we're all absolutely agreed that targeted intervention direct targeted intervention is very important to help our young students from the travelling community. And that respect for diversity, which a number of you mentioned, is just so important within our schools, and to support the school staff and families and the travelling community in itself. And that whole notion of having positive role models is extremely important. I just want to recognise those that are in the public gallery, because we have quite a number from the different groups, and I think it's important to say that we have Councillor John Hogan, who is the National Chairperson of the ETBI. We have Eileen Flynn from the National Traveller Women's Forum, Anastasia Crickley, Dr Maureen Kenny, Kathleen Lawrence and Tracy Riley from Pavey Point, Margaret McDonough from the Yellow Flag, and Helen Brogan and Jacinta Brack from the Irish Traveller Movement. And we also have, I mentioned Ian earlier, and his parents, Patrick and Julia McDonough, are with us also. You're all very welcome, and we hope that it proves to be a fruitful experience for all of you as well. I'm now going to go to the members for them to ask questions, and we'll have the opportunity for the stakeholders to come back. So, Senator Rowan, you were the first to indicate.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone, for the presentations. I suppose, I mean, I know a few people have mentioned, you know, the reinstating and re-resourcing of what was there before, as if what was there before was actually adequate in the first place. And I kind of think we need to acknowledge that by saying that everything went disastrous for the travelling community when austerity budgets destroyed certain aspects of the education system is not really being true to actually the damage that has been done to the travelling community for since the early 60s. Do you know what I mean? And I suppose my question would be is that if we're saying or making recommendations that we should reinstate a visiting teacher, was that actually enough? Or are we just saying that's what we had before, so we'll just aim for that again? Or actually saying we deserve a lot more than this, and we need much more targeted approaches than what were there in the first place, because that actually wasn't working either. It might have been an extra bit of help at the time, an extra resource, and it might have been positive. But was it really actually achieving the goals that the travelling community needed to achieve? So I don't think we should herald those initiatives that existed before austerity as some sort of golden chalice that was actually moving the traveller community through the education system and into third level, because I don't think they were, and I don't think that they were enough. And, you know, for me, I'm wondering, we look at third level now, and there's funding now attached to universities if they increase access in their universities. So for access students, which would be minorities across the board and working class students, you know, is there room there to look at that? Actually, whatever about like the Yellow Flag programme and them initiatives, but what if there was funding attached to actually how good of a school you were at actually meeting the needs of minority groups such as Traveller or Roma or other ethnicities? And if 50% of those children aren't in DESH schools, well then should the funding, when it comes to special category groups that are in such deficit in terms of the education system. Should the targeted approaches, should the funding follow the children instead of the schools in relation to the funding following the young person and the family from primary right through to third level or wherever the educational journey, right, and focus on actual families instead of trying to recreate something in schools that wasn't actually really working in the first place. So, I mean, anyone can kind of jump in and answer that when it comes back to the answers on that. Another question I had was around was actually, yeah, so when we talk about racism, I think people have got really used to this word racism, and people don't really understand what actually is behind that and the impact that that has on people. And when people are in schools and they're so afraid of racist attacks that they change their whole identity. And, you know, when my consciousness was first raised of that as a young person, I said it before in the Shanna chamber, was when my friend William, who's unfortunately dead now, but when my friend William, when I went into his home for the very first time and he spoke like a traveller, and I've been friends with him for 12 years, and I was like, I've never heard you speak like that. And it was like I'd heard this whole new person, this new side of him that I had been deprived of because I was like missing out on all this culture and his identity. And I just think to try and go through a whole system suppressing your identity and then come at this stage of the game and go, why are so many traveller people dying of suicide? And it's like, well, hang on, we've completely denied their identity since the 60s, and there has to be some sort of redress due in that. And you don't have to be inside four walls to be institutionalised, and the state has institutionalised the travelling community for far, far too long. So my question really is about what was there was not good enough, even though it might have been a positive resource at the time. So what would you prefer to do, and should the funding follow the child? And actually another question I wanted to ask was, because I know for me, when I speak to women in my community, not necessarily in the travelling community, but when they're really struggling to get their children to go to school past junior cert, and the state decide to take their children's allowance away from them, right? So you have groups already living in poverty, and something that was never supposed to be attached to your educational journey, the state now refuse to give you your children's allowance if your child is not in school. So I'm wondering what impact that's having on the poverty of women in the travelling community. Are women losing their children's allowance at second level when if they're not able to get a form stamped in the school to say that their children are still attending school? Because I know it's happening for other groups, which is also another issue of, you know, increasing the levels of poverty that might exist within some households. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Byrne.
Yeah, apologies, I have to go into the Dáil in the next few minutes, so I'll have to leave, but I will look at your answers on the record. But also have to say the submissions are really, really helpful as well. They're very clear, very concise, and there's a lot for us to follow up, and I'll be following up on them in terms of Dáil questions. I'm sure other colleagues will be as well. And there's not much I disagree with, actually. I think, and notwithstanding Lynn's comments on the pre-2011 supports, it seems that they did some good, so I certainly at a minimum would support bringing them back, but except what Lynn's saying too, that probably needs to be looked at too. Myself and Martin had correspondence yesterday about Senator Kelleher's bill, and I've discussed these issues with Senator Collette as well before, but I suppose you should probably, I mean, Martin invited me to ask as to why that bill is important to travellers and to the community. You could set that out. I've said our reasons publicly that we don't like putting into law curriculums, even though we support compulsory subjects, and I have no difficulty with this being on the curriculum at all. I support it, in fact, but there's no other subject written into law that it should be on the curriculum. Irish is not written into any law that it has to be taught, or English or maths even. And if you could set out why that, the reasons that you would support Senator Collette's very noble bill. I mean, I have no difficulty with the principle of Senator Kelleher's bill, but it's just that legislating for it, I think, is an issue. We've had this issue before, famously with sex education, and actually with history. One of my colleagues wanted a bill to make history compulsory, and I said, yeah, we support it being compulsory, but just not law. And the reason is, for us, I suppose, is it then becomes a political football, and other issues come in, as they do around the world, in terms of what politicians vote for and against. Anyway, that's a side note. Just so I'll be following up a lot of the issues. I think you've raised important points, but just one question, and a number of questions I have that arise from Fergal Broom's contribution. But I'd like really the members of the traveller organisations to respond to it. I think Fergal mentioned in his submission that primary attendance or primary enrolment was 100% before 2011, and then it dropped, or it may have dropped, and he says anecdotally. Do the representative groups have evidence of that, or did they support that contention? And is that correct? And what are the reasons for that? And is that something that the state has a responsibility to rectify, or are there other issues that could be a reason for people not attending primary school? Because certainly, yeah, that's the question there. And then, yeah, that's fine. But I just want to really, the thing speaks for itself. And I just, before I go, I'd love to see a report. I'm sure we will have a report coming out of the committee taking aboard what's said, and each party, I'm sure, will do their own thing on it too. So
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Deputy Byrne. Deputy Sullivan.
Yeah, thanks very much to all of you, first of all, and for your written contributions to us as well. And I mean, just on Deputy Byrne's just last point, absolutely we need to do a report, and I think we particularly need to direct a lot of questions at the Department of Education in particular. And I suppose the first one I would say is that I can't see any excuse for reduced timetables, and I'm not sure who makes those decisions to reduce timetables. Is it the schools, or where does it come from? But I think we should very clearly state that no child who's in school should have their timetable reduced for whatever reason, because all children should be entitled to the same amount of time in education when they're in school. So that's just, I suppose, a simple point. But also the yellow flag, I mean, it's a very good scheme, but it really should be across all schools, and the ideals in it should be across all schools. So maybe Elva would have a comment on how, because it's a relatively small number of schools and it's voluntary, obviously, but I think one of the issues that came up, a few people mentioned, is around the fact that some schools just find ways of not welcoming travellers, even though they're not supposed to. In terms of equality legislation, etc., they shouldn't be doing it, but they do. And, whether there's some way of putting the principles of the yellow flag into all schools and getting that culture of inclusivity into all schools. I know it's not just travellers, it happens that other groups feel excluded from particular schools. And we all know schools that they can't write it into their enrolment policies, but they do. So just if you have any views on how we can get that more inclusive culture into all of our schools, because then I think it addresses some of the issues that Lynn raised around people feeling they have to hide their identity. And also, I would support Colette Kelleher's bill, because I think until everybody knows about the culture, then we are always going to deal with people who are ignorant, who just simply haven't got the knowledge or the information. I suppose I wanted to focus my main questions around consultation and your opportunities to feed into policy and implementation of policy, which many people again said, we've loads of, I think Maria, you said it, we've loads of policies, but we don't have the sort of feedback, the implementation, the information even in terms of statistics around, and various questions on statistics already. We don't actually have a lot of the data that I'm sure you would want to have. So maybe just if you could respond to that. And specifically the National Traveller Education Strategy, which is from 2006. And I think there is a review going on in the department at the moment, but just to ask you if you've had the opportunity to feed in to that review. And also, Martin, you referred to the need for a consultative advisory forum of some kind, so whether the others would agree with that and whether that would be sort of an ongoing engagement between your representative groups and the policymakers and implementers of policy. Just a response maybe on that. And finally, I just wanted to ask about, again, I think it was Lynn referred to the bursaries and the incentives for staying on in higher education, further education, and maybe Nessa would have a comment in relation to further education in particular. But do we have any statistics on the numbers in that regard? Because again, while we have worrying statistics in terms of transfer from primary to post-primary, we also have very low statistics in terms of participation at third level, and that's something, again, that I think we want to see significant progress, but we can't measure any of these progresses unless we have the statistics. So if you have any answers on that, I think a lot of my questions probably, will be ones that as a committee we'll have to raise elsewhere as well. I think the HEA are actually doing that bursary review, or are supposed to have the numbers on that, but just any comments on any of those. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Sullivan. Deputy Funchion.
Chair, again, just to thank everybody for their presentations, and it's really good to see people actually having recommendations and solutions and suggestions in a presentation, because that makes it easier when you're trying to sort of kind of fight for resources. A lot of the questions that I would have asked have sort of been covered. I don't really want to be repetitive, but I do want to say that I totally agree with the whole idea of the education system, and I think unfortunately it can be a very judgmental place. The classroom can be very judgmental, and if you don't fit into a certain category or a certain box that the education system wants you to fit into, school is an extremely lonely place, and you either try and get out of it as quickly as you can, or you absolutely sort of lose your whole self in that system and lose all your confidence and everything. And I think it's so damaging. And when you think of the amount of time that children spend in school and every single day, and the battle having to face into that if it's not a positive experience for you, and the battle that parents face, because you're faced with this, you have to send your kids to school type scenario, and it's not easy. And I think we can't underestimate how difficult that is, and the wider implications that has for your whole entire life and for your self-confidence and sort of how you see yourself in the world as such. And the point that Fergal made in relation to it taking a generation to rectify the cuts, I mean, we're already it's a very bleak picture that's been painted here today in terms of progression and opportunities. So we obviously, as a committee, need to take that on board, and as other people have suggested, need to try and have it raised maybe at DAW level through a report, and because you actually have the answers here and have the solutions here, I think we need to take that on board and raise it elsewhere. The only kind of question really that I have, and I know there's a lot of good suggestions, but if there was one starting point for each person that's here, what would they say is the key? I know sometimes it's hard to pin it down to that one thing, but what would you say is the first key starting point? And just while I have the opportunity, I'd like to welcome Senator Kelleher's bill and the work that she's done in this area, which I think is very good, and just commend her for that. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Deputy. Senator Gallagher.
Yeah, at the outset, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you all here today, and thank you indeed for very straightforward and thought-provoking presentations that you've all made here. I suppose if I would start with Bernard and his contribution, he outlined the history of where we are and how we've got to this point. He outlined the 80% cut in 2011 and in relation to travel education, and I know we can debate, and Lynn made the point that that in itself wasn't a target, but at the very least government need to readdress that. We're 8 years on from that date, and we've been told that the economy is flying and with the fastest growing economy in Europe. It's time our citizens seen the benefits of that. I think the stats speak for themselves. Only 13% of travellers completing secondary education compared to 92% of the settled community. I think that speaks for itself. And I know Martin talked, the quote that you gave out, Martin, I think sums it up for a lot of people. We're here today talking about trying to increase education for the travelling community. I think all of society would benefit from increased education in relation to this entire area, and we all have a lot to learn. And I think that the points are all very well made, and it's been very, very thought-provoking. Some of the points that jumped out at me, and maybe this is where my questions will be focused on, would be, first of all, a number of speakers mentioned the importance of having teachers from the travelling community. Is there any way we could target, perhaps the two gentlemen on the right there might be able to answer that question, or indeed any of the panel members, what could we do to encourage children and young adults from the travelling community to take up teaching? Is there any incentives we can put in place in order to address that? I think a number of speakers made the point about, and when it comes to the home itself, which is vitally important for all our children, let them be travellers or otherwise, and what the home conditions are like. And there's no doubt about it, travelling travelling children are at a very much disadvantage when it comes to that. And I'm thinking about after school for education for parents. What can we do, or what incentives can we put in place to encourage parents to re-engage, if you like, or maybe to engage for the first time in education? But I think that's vitally important. What the child learns and is taught at home has a serious implications for that child going forward. I think that's vitally important, and I'm wondering, is there any specific measures we can put in place to address that particular issue? And I'm thinking about, people talked about the facilities that were available and the obstacles that travelling children and families come up against simply trying to get their child to school in the morning, maybe having no transport, access to broadband non-existent for them, and the costs associated with schooling. Would some form of breakfast club or some form of after-school facility where children from travelling community could get targeted attention, let that be before school starts or after school in the evening, to supervise and progress their further education? I'm just wondering, is there any thought in relation to that? And Deputy Byrne just told me to mention in relation to the timetables and the reduction in timetables. Have you any case studies or any meat on the bone in relation to that, as to maybe that would help us in our thoughts going forward? And in this relation to this particular issue, I would like to also acknowledge the work done by my colleague in the Senate, Colette Gallagher, in relation to this particular issue. She has done great work, and more needs to be done, clearly. Cormac.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Byrne.
Thanks very much indeed, Cathair Naughton, to welcome all the presentations today. And I suppose that a lot of what I was going to ask has been asked, but to go back to ETBI, and they spoke about maybe the payment of an allowance for some of the classes. Is that something similar to the Youth Reach programme maybe that you'd be looking at, or whatever? And would it happen for the students, when say that would be mainstream education, that they would get an allowance? It's just a query, really. I was reading the submission by Presentation Secondary School in Limerick, and I would know it well, and I've been there on several occasions. And I noticed with interest one thing that they pointed out was, I suppose, because some of the parents haven't a high standard of education then doesn't become a priority for the children that are going to school, because there's no encouragement from the parents. But I've seen it in another school in Limerick where there is a number of traveller children, and the school actually brought the parents into the system. They got them engaged in maybe the board of management, or in kind of like a think tank of working with them. They ran classes maybe for people that had numeracy and literacy problems, and with the parents to encourage them then to work with their children, you know. So I just thought that it was a good way of trying to integrate the two, because certainly I know I worked with the Traveller Committee when I was in the council for 10 years, that used to sit in the council, and there was a lot of good reaction or interaction between both sides. But certainly I do think that some of the cuts that were there have to be looked at, and I certainly think that we need to encourage the department, you know, to reinstate some of the supports that were in place, because obviously they were working at one stage, they're not now. But I do think that maybe trying to encourage the parents to get involved in the school certainly might be a way to start. So just your comments around that. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Byrne. I'm now going to move to the non-members of the committee, so Senator Kelleher.
Thank you very much, Cathair Naughton, and for the committee for giving time to this really pressing issue, because when you look at the statistics and you consider them, every time I consider them, they continue to shock me, and I don't think that we can in any way as a society or as this committee or as an Oireachtas be satisfied with what's happening. The presentations have been excellent. They've been very constructive, and I also I suppose it's nice that the traveller culture and History and Education Bill has been endorsed. Deputy Byrne and myself might disagree with the tactics of it, but for example, tomorrow we'll be speaking with, and Traveller advisors and activists will be advising the national curriculum for assessment, and that wouldn't have happened without the bill. So we may disagree on sort of, what should or shouldn't be in curricula. And it is terrible that it takes a bill to get that level of attention. So, again, I think the statistics are worth repeating, and Maria, you made some very drew compelling attention. 13% completing secondary education as opposed to 92% in the general population. 1% in third level, 167 people ever in third level education who are travellers. I mean, if we're talking about traveller teachers, where you have a requirement of third level education, well, what hope do we have to make any progress there until that's addressed? And very concerning that the transfer from primary to secondary has fallen from 100% to 80%. I mean, that is telling us something. And I suppose I am concerned about the teaching profession's responsibilities and roles in all of this. And I would like you to think about what kind of report card you'd give yourselves. Would it be an A+, or would it be an F? Because when I look at the statistics, I would have to say that it would have to be a fail, not a pass. And I would like to hear, particularly from Clive Byrne, because there are responsibilities among principals and deputies making decisions about reduced timetables that Bernard raised. Where does the buck stop? And can people here give an undertaking that that practice is eradicated and eliminated, and it doesn't wait for the Department of Education to come and tell us to do it, or a bill to come and tell us to do it? And in terms of the traveller culture and history, there are ways and means that schools now can do what the bill is proposing. It's just that it's not happening. So we have to, go to extraordinary efforts to make sure that ordinary things happen for children, like finishing primary school, like finishing secondary school, like going to university. These are ordinary things. And I would like to hear particularly from Clive and from Fergal, but also from the ETB. Youth Reach is fine, but Youth Reach is an exceptional service. It's great that it's working for some traveller children, but it shouldn't be the norm. It shouldn't be the norm. And we have to have an urgency about this. So I'm interested to hear about the teachers. What training do teachers need to know about how to make schools a warm and welcoming place where traveller children will want to go, and where traveller children can thrive, and they can thrive alongside their children from the settled backgrounds, so that we can make the kind of society that's inclusive and not exclusive, that is inclusive and not segregated. So that's what I'd like to hear about. And I would like that that the committee, and I know I'm not a member, I'm a visiting guest here, that will make strong recommendations about the role of the teaching profession in relation to raising its game. Cuts have to be addressed. All sorts of things have to be addressed, but I absolutely think if I was a teacher and looking at those statistics, I wouldn't be very proud of my record in relation to this.
Senator, I just want to say thank you for your contribution, and to say I have no doubt about your good intentions, but I certainly would not want to be calling in the reputations of our excellent teachers. And this committee always recognises the very good work that teachers do at primary level, secondary level, and indeed at third level. Well, I'm making it as chair, and I think that we need to work with the teachers and with the teaching professions to ensure that they are better resourced, because we cannot lay it at the door of just teachers, because obviously in terms... No, you will not interrupt me, I'm chairing.
Hang on a minute.
No,
we lay it at the door of the travelling homes at many stages
meeting.
through the conversations. We talked about
Senator,
parents.
you had
we talked about traveller parents.
You had 15 minutes.
If the home doesn't
Senator, you had 15 minutes.
And you want to take up for teachers, but we didn't take up for traveller mothers 2 minutes ago.
I am responding to the Senator. Please give me that opportunity as chair of the committee. But what I am saying is that we need to work with the teachers and with the teacher organisations to make sure that traveller children and indeed other vulnerable children have the best opportunity to learn within that school environment and outside of the school environment. Indeed, we need to look at a number of resources that can be put in place and should be put in place to support the children and to support the teachers, and I think that's hugely important. I'm going to, and I just want to say that, I did say at the start of the meeting that members should not make any criticism of people outside of this House, and I just want to put that on the record again. Deputy Kenny, you wish to speak?
I'll be very brief, because I think most people have covered all the questions, and I don't want to be repetitive, and thanks everybody for very insightful presentations. And as Coletta said, the stats kind of speak for themselves, and it's pretty shocking. I think you'll probably kind of comment on that. I just want to make one observation in relation to the cuts since 2011. Obviously, they've had a hugely detrimental effect on the travelling community, particularly educational needs. Has any of them cuts been, any of them, well, 87% of them cuts, have any of them been reversed? None. So that's none at all. That says everything,
Okay. Do you have any other questions?
No, that's it.
Okay, no, thank you. Well, I'm just going to comment briefly and then I'm going to come back to you. But just a few key things, and most of the issues have been addressed by my colleagues here. We know that from the 2016 census, a number of statistics which are absolutely horrific. The fact that only 13% of travellers complete secondary education in comparison with 92% of the general population. The fact that less than 1%, and we know the numbers, I think it was only 41 last year, are in third level education. The fact that 17.7% of travellers have no formal education whatsoever, and again in comparison with 1.4% of the general population. And as Deputy Kenny said, the statistics speak for themselves. Now, anecdotally, we know that an increasing number of traveller students are leaving schools with poor numeracy and literary skills. And I'm wondering what we can do, not just in terms of making sure the resources are there, but obviously we need to monitor that. And we need to monitor that on an ongoing basis. I think that's really important to try to see, can we get some progression. In terms of education initiatives to combat discrimination, because I know a number of you have spoken about discrimination within the school, and certainly the yellow flag obviously does work around that. I agree with my colleague Deputy Sullivan, we need to see it in more schools, but if there's other initiatives that you feel would be helpful. Also, there was comment about the relationship between early years education and future life outcomes, and we know that from other research that has been done, the longer that somebody spends in education, they're going to have better health outcomes, they're going to live longer, and better opportunities obviously of attracting employment. I wonder, would it be useful to have an extra early year education maybe for traveller children, so having a specific extra year there. The engagement, I know Pavel pointed out about a weak engagement between education providers and traveller society. That's something that obviously should be addressed, and we need to, but if you would like to make any other comment in relation to that. I think that, and we got this in some of the other submissions from some that weren't here, about the gender roles. And I think it's important, and again, Maria would refer to this, about, and I've spoken to teachers who have experience of teaching girls and boys from the travelling community, and they see this as a huge issue. And in speaking, and they have a very good relationship, one being a home school liaison teacher and has a fantastic relationship with a lot of the traveller mothers who want the best, absolutely, for their children, but that there is that issue about wanting their daughters to get married at an early age and not seeing other opportunities for them as viable also. So it's just how we try to address those. Also, I agree with the possibility of funding following children, because the fact that we have 50% of our students in non-debt schools definitely is a problem. So we should have more resources. In terms of the capitation grant for traveller children, it's far too low. It's only €240 a child unless there's a special class, but it's 2 to 3 times lower than that in terms of grants for other vulnerable children. So I think that, you know, that it should be one of the recommendations that we would make. But if you had any thoughts on anything that any of the members have said. So what I'll do, maybe I'll start in reverse order. So Nessa, I'll go back to you first and then we'll work our way around. Thank you.
Chairperson, just before...
Yes, sorry, you hadn't indicated, so I didn't.
I indicated there, just my apologies, I was at another meeting and I was late coming in there. But Byrne, just what I could pick up there from some of the questions that were asked earlier in relation to the resources and the cutbacks since 2011. Perhaps you might expand on that. And also, from my colleague here, you indicated that there has been no improvement since 2011 to the current time. And also, I'd like to support what you, Chairperson, said in relation to the teachers. I mean, people can complain or whatever else, but I think that if the resources are in place for the teachers, and perhaps maybe we might get some comment on that as well, like, you know what I mean, because this is not the place to come in here to start criticising teachers or whatever else, I firmly believe. And I know where my colleagues are coming from, perhaps some of them, but what I'm saying is that if there is additional resources needed for teachers and whatever else, that this committee, we're here to listen, and indeed hopefully that we can help and assist in the comments that you're making here this evening. I would also say, like, you know, the statistics that we have in relation to say students going from national school to secondary, that's alarming that there's so few, and statistics, you have all the facts there. Why is, you know, I mean, what can be done? How can we improve that? And perhaps maybe Chairperson, that I might get some comments on that. Thank you very much.
No, that's fine. Thanks, Deputy McLoughlin.
I think it's legitimate to be critical of teachers. You know, they're not immune from criticism. They're great teachers, but, you know, I think it was legitimate to raise the question of, you know...
Well, it can't be... No,
well, it's just to be fair, we
cop... There's been a couple of voices, and, you know, I think in fairness, we need a bit of balance.
But I think there is balance now, so it's fine.
That's why I interjected.
But it doesn't take funding to create aspirations in children. Right, so we can talk about funding all we want. It doesn't take funding not to be racist. It doesn't take funding not to be non-discriminatory. That stuff doesn't take funding, and that stuff exists within the teaching profession, and it just needs to be acknowledged. And just acknowledged, not saying every teacher, it just needs to be acknowledged.
Well, the vast majority of teachers certainly are not like that. I'm going back to...
I don't think you can tar everyone with one
brush. No, that's the point I'm making.
So, you know, I mean,
to raise a question
it's not
teachers
right
if you want.
We get very exercised when we're being criticised. Middle class white teachers from rural Ireland. Look how exercised we are. Can you actually now transfer that to what it would be like to be a traveller?
Now, if we can continue with the meeting, Nessa, I've asked you to respond, please.
And it's probably timely to provide some balance to the points that are being made. And I absolutely agree. Making school an environment where people want to go, irrespective of their background, is what we are all about. That's what we do, and that's what we should be doing. For me today, one of the points was, what would be your starting point? And again, I love these opportunities to listen to initiatives like Yellow Flag. Because again, I'm not a long time in the role. It's something that I wasn't aware of. So for me, that's a starting point to explore and follow up to today, and in response to how can we expand that, and how can we make that happen. in answering the questions, and I've tried to cover everyone's and tick them off, so please come back to me if I haven't. The issue around timetabling, again, is something that is certainly new to me. It's certainly not a position that the ETB sector or ETB schools take as a position that it's how we deal with things, because it's not dealing with things, and it's certainly something I will be going to explore and see what is the situation in our sector, because it's certainly new to me today. The CPD for teachers. This is a really good example that I can add to a list of examples of areas that we need to provide CPD. In ETBI, we're really well placed to provide that CPD for our sector, and it's something that can be delivered upon. There are many other areas, like multi-denominational approach to making the school environment a welcoming environment, that I think we can tie all of these things into as a good practice approach to how we look after children in our schools. That's something I will be taking from today, to address the challenges that have been outlined, real challenges by people in our schools and all schools, but to also support the teachers who sometimes just don't know, who sometimes are bringing their unconscious bias to stuff and interactions they have. So I think it's just about acknowledging the good work that's being done by our teachers, and acknowledging that sometimes we actually need to say there needs to be support in terms of CPD to change what we're trying to change. So I certainly can take that on board and will do something in that regard. The incentives, what would they look like? And I absolutely agree with your point. Youth Reach shouldn't be the norm. Youth Reach is put up there as an example of what works, and it absolutely works. But if our system was working, Youth Reach would be a plan B for maybe children of any background that would need it, and that's what it should be. And all of the initiatives and the action plan that we have and all of the policy documents need to start being implemented to make this a plan B that's just for everyone, and not a plan B that we put up there as the gold star in how we're achieving. So I absolutely take that on board. The reinstatement of the cutbacks. I think it was a really valid point to make, that sometimes we think that going back to what we had is all we should expect. And it was certainly a learning for me in the submission that we put in, that sometimes we need to actually think differently, and that just because we had that doesn't mean it worked anyway. So it's certainly something that we might consider and even add into something that we would put back to the chair if there were different thoughts we had around looking at the bigger picture and actually looking forward rather than looking back. And my final piece, I think I've answered everything. Oh, the last idea that, again, ETBs are really well placed to deliver on really quickly is a suggestion made by yourself, Senator, around the collaboration at school level with the parents. I mean, because the literacy and numeracy service is something that goes hand in hand with what we're trying to do here, there are pilots and initiatives we could implement really quickly in that. If that works, why wouldn't we try and do that? It's a really good idea, and something, again, that I'm going away with. I don't think I can change the world, but I certainly do think a lot of what's been recommended is practical, and we can explore it. Again, I said I had the opportunity before we came in to meet and listen and talk to some of the other stakeholders who know what will work and what won't work better than I ever would. So there will be follow-up with the stakeholders outside of this environment to look at some practical pilots, some measurement. As Martin said to me, we need to get better at measuring whether it's working or not. So we put it up there as something that we've done, and we don't really get to the point of measurement. So in our sector, that's where we're moving to. We like to talk about good practice. You know, baselining and measurement is the only way you know whether it's good and working or not. So I hope I've covered all the questions that were...
Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much, Nessa. And Fergal, I'm going to come to you now.
As a school principal and an educator, but particularly I think as a trade unionist, I consistently strive, and I think a teaching profession consistently strive and work at trying to make schools as inclusive as possible. And of course we don't always succeed because these are quite complex issues. And I think educators have to constantly not be hypocritical and be open to listening to advice they get from wider society and from communities, and to listen and to learn, because that is the nature of a profession. And there is nothing more a teacher wants than to make the experience of education as beneficial and as positive as possible for their members and for the pupils that they teach. Some of the practical issues that Kathleen Funchion answered, like what would I, from listening to everybody today, I think when we look at the restoration of cuts, one of the key things when we're talking about trying to respond to a community and trying to understand a community, the visiting teacher worked at different levels as a bridge between schools and the wider travelling community. So the chance to break down some of those barriers, and when that was taken out of the system, it did have an effect on those particular schools where some of the issues we're talking about now, maybe particularly if their parents had a bad experience in school, the visiting teacher was able to relay that directly to the school, whereas the homeschool liaison teacher didn't have that years of experience of doing that. And when that was just cut overnight, that had a kind of a dramatic effect. I think the idea of the NCCA, I think that's a wonderful idea. I'm just on a separate thing involved in the ITO on a global citizenship schools, where we're trying to promote on all issues, social justice and human rights issues in programmes. We're trying to embed it in the curriculum. And I think the yellow flags and getting that into, I would personally have 100% support for it. I think that's a great idea. And it was in reflecting on this when I was coming here today, it really dawned on me as a teacher of nearly 30 years, I don't think I ever taught a lesson on the travelling community. And it's really only when you're hit with that, when you have to, coming from the committee, you have to question yourself on these. That's quite stunning, really. And I must have taught thousands of lessons over the years on all kinds of issues, all types of countries, and yet that was never in a book that I either chose to or had to deliver to a class. On grants following the children, the school I work for in Airfield, it's a non-DESH school, but before one of the cuts that happened that has not been restored, and there's very little talk of being restored, we used to get a grant as a non-DESH school to help supplement children that we felt were at need. And that could be, when you're looking at in the 50% non-DESH schools, that could be something to be looked at. Because as you said, the capitation grant, it only covers 80% of the heating in a school and ensures all those things. But a particular grant that is earmarked to help children who need to access the curriculum more so, the restoration of that. And yes, you're right in saying we weren't exactly in nirvana in 2011, but it's certainly better than it is now. And as you know, that child poverty rates have risen 11% since then and since those cuts. So whether that's a direct result of that. But definitely the some element of VTT, now whether you increase it in extra homeschool liaison teachers, extra ways of getting out and trying to kind of bring the community into the school and bring the school out to the community and bridge those gaps would be very important. I think that's most of the stuff I can answer. Any other questions?
Okay, thank you, Fergal. Clive?
Thanks to the deputies and the senators for, their comments and questions. I am grateful for the endorsement of teachers, but I wouldn't be very, very precious as a leader of second-level schools, to realise that there aren't issues that arise from time to time. But I thank the Chair and the committee members for their endorsement of the teaching profession, which I think is good, because by and large we do really good work in our schools. Many of the members expressed surprise about the issue of reduced timetables. I just in my opening remarks mentioned that from what we could glean from our commentary with second-level principals and deputies and their links, that there seemed to be very good interaction between traveller students at primary level up until 5th class, and at that stage then there began to be issues of attendance or discipline or whatever, maybe mainly to do with puberty or growing. But by the time the students were coming in 2nd level, if you were to be in a situation where you had a reduced timetable, chances are that was because of emotional and behavioural difficulties, of anger management issues within the schools. And in many, many instances, the question of a reduced timetable would be agreed between the school and the education welfare or the NEP psychologists to be in a situation where what you wouldn't want was it to become the norm, but only for a very, very reduced time, a very short space in time. It shouldn't be seen as a nirvana to, have the child on the school books but not be benefiting from the system. It's really, really important that most of the students in the schools, and many students that would be on reduced timetables, would be working on particular individual plans to make sure that they were getting back to the full timetable. But in some schools, and I did say it earlier on, like Irish education is characterised by competition rather than collaboration. And the issue to do with admissions policies and soft barriers and other areas like that, like Senator Ruane is absolutely right. There's supports that existed in 2011 and how much has changed in the Ireland over the last time. But my view is that if something is named, and in the context of education and how things have moved on in the last number of years, if Travellers is to be seen as a priority within the system, if particular resources are allocated, they can be quantified, they can be judged, and see if they need to be adapted. But the nirvana that Deputy Funchion mentioned earlier on that I would like to see is that as a society within our schools, we would be governed by inclusion, and that we would have a positive climate of respect for everybody within the schools. But we need to look at it, and in another context and with another hat, I was working as the chair of the Board for Senior Cycle in the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment. And certainly the level of consultation that has taken place with the various education partners is designed to try and bring about a senior cycle that meets our needs for the students in our society in the current climate. And the level of subjects that we have where success at Leaving Cert level is seen as your ability to get through a Leaving Certificate and to move on to 3rd level. That will not meet the needs of the traveller children that we have in our system. We need to be looking to put in place the necessary supports to encourage homeschool links where education is valued. Because I was very taken by my colleagues on my right about the influence of mothers and the educational attainment of mothers. And students feel discriminated in their schools because they can't associate with their own culture. So the Senator's bill is very, very welcome. I take Deputy Byrne's point that do you want to put it into law or should we make it compulsory is another issue. But from the point of view, I hope I've explained to members that the timetable, reduced timetable, it's used as a mechanism to try and cope with a particular issue when it arises, largely due to emotional or behavioural difficulties within the schools, but it should never ever be seen as long-term. And as an association, we would be looking to use the educational supports and the resources of TUSLA and of NEPS to make sure that an individual plan was put in place to meet the needs of every student, traveller or non-traveller. And just to assure the members that I'm sure that there are far more non-traveller children who may be operating on reduced timetables than there are traveller children, but it should never ever be seen, as the norm. I agree with the points that were made by Deputy O'Sullivan that if the number of schools participating in Yellow Flag must be much greater. And certainly from our point of view, we have participated in the steering committee and we're very, very active in the Yellow Flag project, but it is inherently difficult to get school leaders, principals or deputy principals to be willing to become involved within the project because of a lack of recognition and resources from the Department of Education. And if the department was to recognise this as an important important initiative to promote the traveller culture within schools as part of Deputy Kelleher's or Senator Kelleher's proposals in terms of traveller culture and their lifestyle and circumstances. I think that would be very, very good. But the biggest issue, I suppose, is coping with the invisible discrimination that exists and our own unconscious biases. And whether it's through CPD within the ETB sector or else within the Teaching Council and their GUSAN pathways and their involvement in continuous CPV over the next number of years, it should be possible to raise the issue of bias and unconscious bias within our education system, that it could be tackled within that. Because that type of bias that exists against travellers is also in other parts of the country coming to be an issue for students who are from different races, from the New Irish and so on. And that's an issue that is really, really difficult for schools to cope with. And in many instances, integration issues within our schools are key challenges that school leaders are having to tackle with. But an awful lot of the difficulties is that it is not named. Right? And it's not spoken of, and because it's not named and it's not spoken about, and we try to move things around, because that's the way we do things in education in Ireland in many instances. Things are because they have always been thus. But Ireland is a different society now. We have to have a vision for society promoting the values that we want to produce from our young citizens coming into, leaving the schools and coming into society. And if we're not in a position to have our own Indigenous travellers coped with better within our school structures, it will be very, very difficult for us to move within the change. Like I was in doing research for the presentation today, there are over 30,000 travellers within Ireland at the moment. Over 10,000 are involved in the labour market. There are high instances of unemployment and so on. So in many instances, the travellers don't see the benefits of what they can get through education and training. And we need to make that very, very clear within our schools so that we can encourage people to buy in. Certainly the review of the travellers and the Roma, which is ongoing at the moment, and there was a meeting, I think, about it last Friday, which we were represented at. I would hope that would quantify the issues that would need to be tackled, and given that is a Department of Education initiative, I would hope that there would be progress within that. Colleagues mentioned about bursaries and other areas like that. The payment of an allowance for programmes, now that actually is a good thing, but it is also a bad thing, because if traveller children are not happy in school, there's nearly an incentive for them to move into a programme where there is a payment of an allowance, rather than stay on in formal education, because they don't have experience of the concept of deferred gratification, that if you stay in the education sector, it will be better for you to be able to go and get a better job, because as in one of the briefing documents that came from my colleagues, the aspirations that people had for working as farriers or with animals, or getting involved in sports like boxing and so on, all of those things are setting the barrier very, very low. And we know, even though the numbers are very, very small, from the quality of travellers that have moved on to further and higher education, that when you get the opportunity, it's important that people are able to take it and act as role models. But on the basis of the point that Senator Kelleher made, if there are only 100, so many 100+ people from the travelling community who have got involved in higher education, it's very, very difficult to see how you could attract or incentivise people then to get involved in the teaching profession. So, Chair, I've gone on a good while. I'm not sure if I've answered all of the questions or comments that have been made, but I'm conscious of our colleagues who need to do it.
Thank you. Maria.
First of all, can I just say that if we really want to see change in education, then we do need to be frank and honest about the realities of the education system today with regard to traveller children. And I will just make this point in relation to teachers. I mean, I think in your earlier part of your presentation, sorry, your name, Clive, when you were talking about the principles, you recognised, and again, you recognised the bias that can be there within teachers in terms of their views of traveller children in front of them. And let me tell you, As a traveller woman who has gone through the education system in the 70s and 80s in this country, as a traveller mother who has put her child through the education systems in the 90s and the 2000s, there is blatant racism from teachers, in some teachers in those education systems. I've had to listen to my son come home from school and tell me that a teacher in the school today told him to go home and take off his neck or stalk chain because he had a tin bracelet on his arm. So the reality is that from my work in the organisation that I work in, and from listening to traveller women who are engaging in those spaces at local level and at national level, I am not unique in that there are many, many experiences of where traveller children in the education system are experiencing, racism and discrimination, and that's the reality of it. And I'm not saying every teacher, but there are many examples of where traveller children have this experience within our school today. And if we are being honest about the realities of what the situation is, one of the key barriers right across the board in terms of education and other areas of policy, I grant you, is the issue of racism. So I don't think we can do the change in isolation of addressing those conditions. There are challenges within the community, yes, but I think it is unfair to say that travellers do not see value in education. Travellers are not seeing outcomes from education. They're not seeing outcomes in terms of employment, in terms of further opportunities, whether it be in education or elsewhere. And just one thing, we are beginning to see traveller children coming through secondary school. And what we're seeing, usually when that trend starts to happen, it picks up and it grows and more children. We are now seeing younger siblings. It's harder in some families to get younger siblings to the end because they're seeing older siblings coming through the secondary school system with no outcomes from that secondary school system. So I do think we have to be really careful that in the work that we're doing, that we're not generalising or stereotyping. There are challenges within the community, but we need to be very careful that we're not blaming the community because of the reality of the education system. One child coming through an education system without being able to read and write, okay, there's questions. Many from a group of people going through the education system and, where they're going through entire primary school systems and coming out and not reading and writing. That is the responsibility of the education system. Let's be very frank about that. And I suppose when I was talking earlier in the context of women and girls going through education as role models, I just want to be very, very clear that the majority of traveller women that we engage with, the majority of traveller women engaging with schools, want their children to have a good education. They want them in the education system and they want them to get through that. The reality is that they are not seeing the outcomes, the fair outcomes and the real outcomes that they should be getting in terms of employment and in terms of which I've already said. So we just need to be careful that the community doesn't get blamed here and the real conditions that need to be created from early school to right up to further and continuing education in terms of third level get addressed. There is a need for targeted initiatives right across the board. I think it was asked earlier on, is there an additional school year for younger traveller children? Targeted initiatives and putting in the resources to ensure those targeted initiatives are being appropriately and adequately resourced is really, really important. We do not want a segregated provision. As travellers, we've had a segregated provision in this country. It has not worked for us. As somebody who has come up through traveller-only classes in schools, I am telling you it hasn't worked for us, albeit I've gone to third level. It hasn't worked in the main for travellers in relation to segregated provision, but we do need targeted initiatives. You cannot mainstream. You can only mainstream if everyone's at an equal starting point. Travellers are not at that equal starting point in terms of where we need to be. So you need targeted initiatives across the board. You do need scholarships and bursaries with regard to traveller teachers. We do have traveller teachers. I don't doubt that there's traveller teachers out there. The reality is that they're not recognised, they're not identifying as travellers within that. And that will tell you that the conditions in relation to travellers who have gone through it and who are in the teaching spaces, there's, and I think that I've heard a traveller woman at one of the Oireachtas spaces when we were looking at the issue around recognition of traveller ethnicity, speak about a cousin who was a principal in a school and was petrified that it would become aware that she was a traveller. That's the reality of it. Those are conditions that are not conducive, and there is racism and there is discrimination that feeds into that and is making those conditions continue. There is a need for implementation. We have a range of actions. We may need more, but the reality is if we got implemented what we have, we would at least begin to see the change that's needed. So most important is implementation and monitoring, and the data and the role that it plays within that is crucial. And us being able to access that data is equally important. The ethnic identifier that's there at primary level, needs to be right through the system, but there needs to be, serious additions to that and how it gets done and the training that's attached to all of that. The engagement with traveller organisations needs to be real and meaningful. With regard to the question I think that was asked earlier around the review of the education strategy, as far as I'm aware, there's a desk review taking place. We do believe and are led to believe that there will be some engagement with traveller organisations around that. But engagement needs to be real and it needs to be meaningful in relation to that. I think it was yourself, Lynn, that mentioned the kind of punishment in terms of children not going to, around children's allowance. I need to check that. But in any circumstances where you have that kind of stick approach, which penalises the community, that does not work when you do not have the conditions in place to ensure equality of actually getting in the school door, participation and outcomes. Having transfer from primary school to secondary school at 80%, when the majority of children are in and around the age of 12 at that, and the legal age to be in school in this country is 16, is very telling of an education system that is not meeting the needs of an entire group of people. And it's happening. And schools are, there's no places, or they're not offered in places, or they're offered in places where it's inappropriate for the children to go, needs to be stamped out. Those kind of practices, 80% of transfer from primary to post-primary is not the fault of the parents in all those circumstances. Many of the instances is, and we've seen countless examples of where schools are not accepting children. And that's the reality of it. And that's what's, I would say the greater level of that statistic is coming from that as opposed to any kind of parent involvement. I've probably gone.
Thanks, Maria. Yeah, thank you. Martin.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Chair. Just a few brief comments. As I said as part of the opening statement, there's a wider context here to travellers having access to education at all levels. And we need a multifaceted approach to deal with poor living conditions. Many travellers are living on side of the road or living on sites with no access to water, electricity, sanitation. But yet, despite those very difficult circumstances, they're making tremendous efforts to get up in the morning under very difficult circumstances and get their children ready for school. That has to be recognised. There is ambition there. There is generally, a feeling that the education is quite important and it's valued. And I think it's important to try and challenge that myth or stereotype that travellers are disinterested in education and lack ambition. We don't lack ambition. We lack opportunities, and quite often these opportunities are what you might define as racism, both at the individual level and the institutional level. And I think there has to be an acknowledgement of that we have an educational system that promotes, if you like, an ideology of homogeny. It only reflects one certain world view and does not encompass respect for cultural difference or human difference. And that's why I commend Colette Kelleher in spearheading this travel education and history bill. I think that will have a really profound impact when it comes to fruition and gets implemented in school. And I do think it needs to be compulsory. I disagree with Thomas. Compulsory is compulsory, and if that means a legislative basis to it, well then that's what it means. If it's no legislative basis to it, well, then it's not compulsory. It's discretionary. And teachers and principals can decide whether or not they want to implement it or so forth. And, that goes back to the point. What we need here is an institutionalised policy response to creating an inclusive educational context for travellers. We have very sympathetic teachers. We have very sympathetic principals. We in Paffy Point get invitations all the time, no more than the other travel groups, to come out where they have a human rights day or to do some talk with their staff, their teachers and so forth. But that's not really sustainable from our point of view. Like, we're NGOs, we have very little resources. It's not sustainable. So we need an embedded culture of respect for human rights and diversity built into our curriculum, and that requires, anti-racism, intercultural training into teacher training colleges and so forth. So somebody asked me recently about education. How do you know when you've really made a difference or you have achieved success? Well, I'll tell you why. I'll tell you how I would measure it. Recently, Cindy Joyce received her PhD from UN, the University of Limerick. Great achievement for herself personally and her family. But why are we celebrating that? Why is that so special? Why has Cindy been on many chat shows and radio shows and the media? We shouldn't be at that stage. We should be beyond that, where it's the norm, somebody said earlier on, where travellers are graduating from universities with diplomas, degrees and PhDs. And I think it's a very sad indictment on society that we're still at the stage where we're rejoicing in these type of achievements, and they are important, of course, but I think we need to move beyond that. Schools are not a very welcoming place. It's a microcosm of the wider society quite often in terms of racism and discrimination. And I'll finish at this point. My own son, 2 years ago, when he was sitting his leaving in Ratholt Community College, he was called a knacker on 3 different occasions. This is right in the middle of his leaving cert. Come back very emotional, very upset. School didn't deal with it properly. I've always taught my son to be very dignified in fighting racism. Third time he lashed out. Okay? Don't condone it, obviously. I and my wife were summoned into the school by the principal. And what came across at that meeting was that the racism got marginalised, got lost. And what became the focus was this stereotype of a young, aggressive male traveller. That became the focus. And I found myself getting really frustrated. So there are those issues that need to be contended with. So really what needs to happen here, in my opinion, two things. We need the re-establishment or the equivalent of what we had before. We have no mechanism to be involved in consultation on travel education policy with the Department of Education. We need a forum or some mechanism where we can engage with them. We have that lived experience. We know what works. We need to be allowed to inform policy development and policy implementation. And I'm really disappointed. And when I heard there was a meeting last week in terms of the review of the travel education strategy, but yet no travel organisations, certainly we weren't anyway on Pavia Point, part of that. And that's indicative, really, of the systemic problems that we're having, I would say, with the Department of Education in particular. So I'll leave it with that, Chairperson.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Elva. Yeah, thanks very much. I'll try and address the specific questions relevant to the yellow flag, but I know that starting Senator Ruan, you were just commenting on the visiting traveller, teacher traveller service, and what other support, was that the right one to revisit, and what other supports? And I know Fergal, I think, addressed that really well in terms that service was there to bridge a gap, but it was very much targeted at travellers themselves. And I think the other supports that are needed are around travelling the majority community and targeting the institutions and school as I suppose the delivery point of the institution of education. And I suppose that's what the yellow flag has, a kind of a multi-layered approach, or an 8-step approach which tries to do that. So in that we're trying to look at both the activities that happen within the school, the activities that happen within the curricular programme, and also how well-informed teachers are in relation to that, what kind of celebratory activities are in place, and then also what's being done at a sort of management and policy level. So this idea of asking the schools to review their policies in relation to bullying, but also in relation to anti-racism, and to develop anti-racist policies in place. So we're trying to address this at a number of levels. And I know what you're saying, Clive, in relation to leadership within the school as well. In our experience, definitely, where we meet open principals who are actually open to achieving a culture of change within their school, that's where the yellow flag is most effective. So those principals, and then usually what follows is the teachers within the school, if they're open to saying something about our system needs to change, if that's their starting point, then they will achieve change. And so we think that's really important, and we think that's why having kind of a several strand approach kind of works to that. And just to address Senator Byrne's issue around involving parents in school, that is also a step within the Yellow Flag programme as well. So we invite all parents, but particularly parents of minority ethnic children, to join the Diversity Committee, which takes the leadership position in the school. It's mostly students with teachers and parents, and traveller parents are invited onto that. But we're also promoting that that schools will engage with the traveller community locally, so that they engage with traveller parents, but not in this way about addressing individual issues relating to their children, but talking and developing relationships over time. And I think you were talking about this as well, Senator Kelleher, about developing relationships that are properly about listening to what those family needs, and where those relationships develop in schools. That's where we are seeing outcomes, and it really, year on year, where there are relationships built up between the traveller community through the parents and through traveller representative organisations in local areas, of which there are many across the country. So it's very possible to develop those kind of relations. This is where change can happen as well. So there was another couple of points that I want to address as well. Just, Clive, it did occur to me as well when you were talking about the issues arising at 5th class level, that they may not just be around kind of puberty but also a time when bullying really maybe starts to become a big feature in terms of students, and also identity. So children getting to the age of recognising their own identity and the difference with other people's identity as well. And one of the things that we find is most surprising, we ask the schools to survey their students and to survey their parents, and we are asking them to survey about their experiences in school, and also if they've had experiences of racism, or if their children have had experiences of racism. And what we find is yes is always the answer. In fact, I think I have some figures here. In the last 2 years, we would have had children of about between 31 and 35% reporting racism, experiencing racism within school, of those who took part in those surveys, and also a very high number reporting that those would be regular occurrences. So it is, as it is throughout our society, racism is prevalent in schools at every level. What we do find surprising is that schools often are totally amazed by the results of those surveys, and they don't want to believe that it's true. So, you know, it's something that teachers need to understand, and need support to understand. So we have lots of relationships with teachers in schools that have been built through the kind of 10 years to date of working on the yellow flag. And what we find is teachers reflect everybody in society. They range from being people who are open and have some awareness to people who are closed-minded, and that's the way it is. And because there isn't any awareness raising done at the teacher training level that's compulsory around intercultural and more understanding equality, that sometimes those issues aren't addressed at all. What we do find is either there may be very paternalistic views, even where teachers want to be supportive, they have quite paternalistic attitudes towards travellers. So some of what we're all talking about today is around, I think, expectations of travellers. And people have very prejudiced expectations around travellers. They're not high. They don't expect travellers to achieve the same educational outcomes, and that can be really a feature across the board within the education system, and it's something we really need to address. And I think a lot of us are in different parts of the organisations are saying those are the things we want to address. And I know training is a big part of what the Yellow Flag tries to do. It is a step within the programme, but it's only a 2-hour training session within the schools. All of the schools come back and tell us it's not enough. They really like the training and they want more. So we've developed, I suppose, a different tool, something to add on to that training, which is a 30-minute 6-step module on self-awareness training for teachers. So this is something that actually all adults and people within the school system can access, and it's about looking at your own self in terms of prejudice and bias. And this is an add-on feature that we've just added to the Yellow Flag programme, just to try and address that issue, so people get a chance to look at their own value system, at bias, at prejudice, at what we're talking about, whether it's institutional, unconscious biases, and we think that's going to really help as well, and that's something that we can make available to Yellow Flag schools. I hope I've addressed everything that came up. Just to say to Deputy O'Sullivan as well, yes, I mean, you know the Yellow Flag programme, and we have been looking for very many years for resources to continue the Yellow Flag programme and to scale and grow it. And it is the vision of the Yellow Flag to have it in every school across the country, because we believe it's something that isn't just targeting at schools that have high levels of diversity, or at DESH schools, who are the schools who tend to apply to us, because they need it. But our vision is to have it that every school in the country should be able to access the yellow flag. It's an issue of resources, and we're conscious that there's a lot of solidarity between the organisations and support for the yellow flag programme, and including with yourselves politically. So that's what we're looking for, is opportunities to keep growing the programme into the future.
Thank you, Elva. And finally, we go to Bernard.
Thank you. I think obviously it was a really good discussion between the deputies and in terms of some of the agencies and ourselves, but I do think that as NGOs we're constantly always reaching out and working with agencies. We're obviously looking to highlight the issues, but also bring real tangible solutions. And I would say in some ways we've been very innovative, very creative in doing that, and the yellow flag is obviously an example of that in terms of looking at racism within the education system. But we've also looked at other areas as well in terms of addressing some of the issues that underpin inequality within Ireland. But I do probably have to bring it back and to say that in terms of the historic context of traveller segregation, and I would equate that to apartheid, in South Africa. That wasn't 100 years ago. That was during the 70s, 80s, 90s. And even today, there are some schools that are still traveller Pacific. And I think that should literally not be accepted in any circumstances. As somebody who, as Marie has pointed out, and I think we're around a similar generation, we have found ourselves in segregated schools in the past. We've found ourselves in special classes with special resources. But the expectations of us during that time was so low in terms of there was no requirement on junior cert, there was no requirement on leaving cert, there was no requirement of us in terms of fulfilling the whole curriculum. And it's interestingly enough today that as a father of 5 children in different ages, that we still see the low expectations of our children today, but we also see their confidence being completely, diminished when they go into schools, because they're finding that their identity is not, acknowledged. You don't feel it's an inclusive, safe environment. They can't, self-identify. And I suppose the bill around I suppose when you pull out some of the key areas and you say which ones would you really press, I think every child needs to feel valued. They need to feel important, and they need to feel fulfilment and satisfaction, and they need to feel that they're a part of society and embedded within society, but also feel that their culture is so important, not only to them, but to their peers, to the teachers, to society in general. And unfortunately, that isn't there at the moment. And I think that that's a fundamental element in terms of the prejudice that exists within wider society. Martin has pointed out that even before you get to school, there are many children who are living in, I would say, substandard, inhumane conditions. They don't have water, electricity, sanitation, they're in temporary accommodation, and yet they're the mothers, they're the fathers that are constantly bringing their school every single day. And they do it because they do have a belief in that they want their children to exceed. They want their children to have the opportunities that they didn't have. And they want them to do their junior cert, to do their leaving cert. But they do encounter a lot of barriers, a lot of challenges in order to succeed and do that, because the expectations are still so low and in terms of what is expected from them. And there is that view in terms of travellers won't be able to fulfil this, they won't be able to achieve these different things. And that stems from the, in terms of you only have 167 in terms of third level education. But on top of that, you also have the cuts of 87%. And I would say, yes, racism and all the other issues are there, but the cuts was significant. It was significant in terms of the progression, in terms of primary, post-primary, and also in terms of third level education. Today we have 82% of travellers unemployed. 82%. That's absolutely at a crisis point. We also have, in terms of the, the turnover from primary to post-primary, has absolutely, again, has been reduced significantly. So we are obviously very concerned, that the strategies, the policies, the resources, everything has been, has not progressed in the way that we would see. And I would also be just a bit concerned that if there was a review in terms of the education strategy and there is no travel representation at that, again, I'd obviously be concerned, and maybe there was, but I think we probably would need some clarification on that. I suppose in terms of going forward, there has to be clear, tangible recommendations that will have clear outcomes in terms of travel education. And I also think that around the inclusion of traveller within the education curriculum is really fundamental, because when we talk about traveller ethnicity in 2017 and we talk about a symbolic statement, that statement now has to become meaningful, and it has to become meaningful to our children in terms of going forward to tomorrow, but it also has to become meaningful in terms of the wider society, because there seems to be still a real lack of understanding of traveller history and culture, and the onus has always been on us to deliver that message. And what we're saying in terms of going forward is that should be a message that's delivered not by us, but it should be delivered in terms of the curriculum, and it should be embedded within that. But I would like to also just thank the deputies and thank the Oireachtas for giving us the opportunity to be here today. And we certainly do look forward to working with the committee and others in terms of going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. I appreciate that. And can I say, if any of the stakeholders wish to make any further submissions to us, they can do so by writing, and we will consider them. I'm not going to let anybody back in because we still have Ian to come and take centre stage. But if any of you have any further comments, I'd be very happy to receive them by email. We'll make sure all of the members do, and we will bear them absolutely in mind in terms of the final report and recommendations that we will be making. But I really appreciate all of the time and effort that you've put into your submissions, to the opening statements, and by being here and engaging with all of us. I think it was a very useful engagement, and I think it certainly will help us as a committee in terms of the recommendations we'll be making to the department. So we're going to suspend briefly just for 1 minute to allow Ian come and take a place. You're very welcome to stay if you wish, and this will be obviously a shorter one where Ian will be making an opening statement, and then the members of the committee will have the opportunity to engage. McDonough, who is a student and I know very interested in politics. He had a work placement here with one of my colleagues, and I had the opportunity to meet with Ian at that stage, and he has a very wide-ranging number of views and opinions and things which are absolutely very welcomed from all aspects of life. But he's just going to talk to us today particularly around his perceptions of education. So, Ian, over to you. You're going to speak for a few minutes and then we'll all have the opportunity to chat to you later.
Deputies, Chairperson, Senators, as you all know, my name is Ian McDonough. I'm 17 and I attend Byrne College in Oireachtas. It's my honour to be here today to speak on my views of the education system as a young traveller in Leaving Cert. Firstly, I'd like to take the opportunity to say that Byrne College is a great school, where there's a fantastic atmosphere, where there's genuine respect between the teachers and the students in the school. I have a lot of encouragement from my teachers and the Scholars Den homework club where I attend, that travelling children can come in and do their homework and have a study area to get their work done. In January 2016, I became the first traveller to ever participate in the BT Young Scientist, and I won second place in 2016 in the biological and ecology section. My project looked at, does the lunar cycle play a role in equine birth patterns? In 2017, I returned to the BT Young Scientist and won the Jack Reston's Award. This is a special award at the BT Young Scientist. My project looked at the cures and folklores of the Irish travelling community. Over the last number of years, I've been campaigning for more speed ramps, play facilities in my local area in Galway City. This gives me a great interest into the world of politics. I'm hoping in the coming years that to be the member of this government and be able to give the people the voice that they need. I'm very proud to be a traveller, and I'm hoping, as being recognised as an ethnic minority, that will make young and old travellers feel proud, as I'm able to feel proud today. I'm hoping, as being recognised as the ethnic minority, that traveller culture, language, history will be taught in schools. This will give a positive change for the future. The yellow flag has been a great part of our school, not just for the travelling communities, but for all communities. As you may be aware of the census, 13% of the travellers only complete second level education, compares to 92% of the general population. Of those travellers who drop out of second level, 55% has left by the age of 15. The numbers of the travelling children who proceed through the third level are just 1%. The major of the travelling people, 70% of them only has primary or lower levels of education. My own dreams and hopes is to join on Garda Síochána and to go in there as a young traveller and to open up and say that I am a traveller in it. We may know there is travellers that's in all work parts, but some of them are afraid to open up because they don't know what's going to be said in the days of coming in their jobs. Well, as a young traveller, I feel that they've painted a very bad picture, with travellers being less or being more on the margin line of society. I think as the future for travelling children is totally dependent on themselves and their increase in participation in education, the workforce, and this must be seen as a priority. For me, education builds self-confidence, awareness and ability to participate in our society. Low levels of education may lead to poor self-esteem, poor job opportunities, poor health, and leads to depression. As we know, it's 7 times higher in the travelling community. The axis of why does travelling people suffer with depression? They're not educated. We need to, us travelling children need to stay in school. We need to go on. It's fair enough to say, oh, I've been in school, I don't feel wanted. We need to stick on the ground. We need to wait there because we are giving the other people the opportunity to take away from us. We ain't taking it away from them, so they shouldn't take away from us. So that's why I'm in school and I'll keep standing on the ground. And I don't care if I don't fit into the stew of the education system. I'll ask my teacher, Miss, I need more resources, or Sir, I need them, and I will demand them because it's my future. These teachers have their future. They got their leaving cert, they got their degree. I don't have it so far. So I will demand whatever I need to get where these people have been today. In conclusion, I think the parents need to encourage the children to get a leaving cert. They need to push their children. Some parents do, and some parents may find it hard to push their kids. I need school principals and the Department of Education to take an accurate measurement together with traveller parents to increase the participation in second level and third level education in schools. I'm freely open to questions now.
Thank you, Ian. Well done. You're a remarkable young man, and I've no doubt that your parents are incredibly proud of you. And we really appreciate that you took the opportunity to travel up here today as well with Ian to support him in which isn't an easy thing to do. I remember being that side before I was a TD, making a presentation. I was a lot more nervous than you were, but thank you for having the courage and having the confidence to come up and to tell us your story. And I have no doubt that you will succeed in your ambition, and that firstly it's to be a guard, and I know you'll make a very valuable difference, and then secondly it's to be a member of the Oireachtas, and certainly wish you well at that, because you have a strong voice. So keep speaking, because you are going to make a difference no matter where you are. I'm going to open now to the members. Senator Gallagher.
You said it yourself, Ian, you're an inspiration yourself, and you should be very proud. And indeed, I'm sure your parents are very proud of you as well. The one thing that comes across in your presentation here today is your determination and your key to succeed. And you're an inspiration to all young people across the country, and I wish you well. You said that you wanted to be a guard and end up in Leinster House. Well, you're talking to somebody that was a member of the Guard Síochána and is now in Leinster House, so it can be done, and I have no doubt that you will do it as well. So best luck to you.
I had no idea. I wouldn't have been talking to him all this time if I had known that. Anyway.
So well done, Ian. Well done.
Thank you. Deputy O'Sullivan.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, Ian. I think it's really valuable to get your experience, because I suppose we're all talking about what should happen for travellers in the education system, and we need to listen to somebody who's actually gone through it. And I'm also impressed at your success in the Young Scientist exhibition, because I think that's a really, really positive, experience for all young people in terms of how it, allows you to think for yourself, to do research, etc., etc. So it's not just about sort of the exam subjects, but it's about actually, developing the kind of skills to really succeed in life. I suppose I wanted to ask you, first of all, what was it in your school that, gave you the opportunities that you've clearly taken and grasped? I know a lot of it is probably in your own self and your own personal determination, but, we heard you were listening earlier on to people saying, that schools don't have enough ambition for traveller children, that they don't expect enough from traveller children, etc. So what was it in your school that we should recommend as a committee that should be available in all schools? And secondly, is there anything that you think we should be recommending to the department? I know you said that they should be monitoring more and they should have the correct information. Is there anything in particular? Because we're here to write a report, and we're here to make a difference as well, and your particular individual experience, I think, is really important. Thanks.
Thank you, Deputy. Thank you, Deputy McLoughlin.
Ian, first of all, you're very, very welcome, and thanks indeed for coming in and giving us your presentation. It's inspirational to listen to what you had to say to us as members of the Educational Committee here, and I think that one thing, certainly, you're not going to take no for an answer. I take that from your contribution there. You mentioned just one thing, and you might expand on it in relation to other colleagues. They've moved on from, say, 15-year-olds, and that's the end of their education or whatever else. How can we, or how you have, and you're going on, and hopefully, not alone will you become a guard or superintendent, but you may also finish up here, and I'm sure there's a lot of fellas and ladies around Galway that will be getting worried about you and your political future. So I wish you well. But I'd just like to ask, in relation to colleagues of yours and in the various schools and that, how can we help encourage more people like you at your age to go on to from national school into secondary education and perhaps maybe on to third level education? How you have obviously, and there's a very valid question from Jan there in relation to how we can certainly encourage more people, because you've heard of the debate that went on earlier, and there's a lot of issues there that have got to be resolved, and I'd just like to, as a member of that committee, to find out how we can achieve that and how we can be successful. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Deputy. Senator Ruan.
Thank you. First of all, I join with my colleagues in expressing congratulations, I suppose, not only to your achievements, but the fact that you will hang on to the cultural part of you that is going to say, I'm a traveller and I'm also these things too. Because I think sometimes what happens is, I know for me, making the journey that I made through life was often quite lonely, because you end up living in limbo between two worlds, where all of a sudden you move so far that you may not feel like, am I still part of the travelling community? Am I part of this new community in the university that I'm going into? And sometimes that can be really difficult to get your head around and go, where do I fit into that? And all you can do is try and maintain your identity and who you are within that and hold that, because where we need to get to is where you're not the exception, you're the rule, you know. And I think sometimes what can happen is, with somebody who is so successful from a minority group like you, and sometimes it happens with me because I left school so young and had children so young, an establishment will herald you and say, that this person done this, why can't the rest of us? And my advice to you as a young man who seems extremely intelligent, extremely confident, is to demand that they don't do that. Do you know? Because what they do is then they place full responsibility on the individual to overcome their own poverty and their own barriers, and it becomes an individualistic trait rather than something that might affect a collective community. So I think my advice to you in all the successes and when you're a guard and you're going to be amazing is to remind people that until you are not an exception, until you are not a story, that's when travellers have achieved true equality. When you can look at your staff meeting in a Garda station and you can see yourself reflected in the people that walk around you. And that's more just advice, because it's something that I've had to struggle with in entering politics, being who I feel I am and where I'm from. And it's just, I hope, a small piece of advice you can take with you along the way on your journey, which sounds like it's going to be a tremendous one.
Now, Ian, just before I come back to you, you heard us talking earlier on about role models and how important role models are. And I've no doubt, and from my previous conversations with you, that you absolutely are a role model in your own community. And I'd like to ask you if you had a role model, and if there was somebody that you had looked up to, and then going back to your own role as a role model among your peers. And I know Deputy McLoughlin touched on that, certainly, in terms of young people your age who might feel like dropping out, how you feel that you can encourage them to stay in education, because education is, as Nelson Mandela said, it absolutely can change the world. And what advice would you give to us in terms of how we can try to help make better recommendations to help your younger neighbours, brothers and sisters to stay in education, what we can do to help? So over to you now.
So, like, the role model, what I dreamed of being a guard. I fell in love with the uniform. That's what I always wanted, was the uniform. But when I was younger, I didn't realise you have to work to get this uniform. I just thought you go in, you put on the uniform, you have the job. But until you go into the education system, you know it's tough to get that uniform. And I had to think, my parents, I've seen them, okay, they may have not worked in the education system, they may have, but they've been role models for us. They've helped us, they got us up every morning, they brought us to school, they showed us the values that they never got. So this is what kept me in it. And to help people, to help young travellers to stay in school is resources. Travelling children, some travelling children may feel lost because they're ashamed to open up in the class and say, oh miss, I don't know what to understand. If travelling children, it doesn't have to be out there front line rubbing it into everyone's face. If a travelling child had somewhere to walk into, like I have the homework club, I can bring any question, any piece of homework back to my homework club teacher and say, now, I need help with this, I couldn't understand it in class. This is what kept me in school, because this teacher showed me, Ian, you don't want to be sitting at home, you want to make the world, and you can change the world if you use your voice. And like in colleges, we see 1%. Why? Because travelling people are not given the hand to get to the colleges. We need the resources. If travelling girls, we may see, they say, oh, travelling girls stay in the education system. It's very rare to see a travelling girl stay in it, but it's great to see them. They also have a role at home. They don't want to kill their culture at home. They have to come home, they have to look after their siblings. But the education system doesn't see this. They see, oh, we'll give them the homework and we want it done tomorrow. Okay, that may be fair and well in some homes, but other homes, the girls and the lads, myself, we need to help out at home. We need to get our home priority too. We need to get it up to 5 standard. We can't just revolve our life around, oh, we need this, we need to go up to the room, we need to lock ourselves in and get this homework done. We need to go out, we need to help our parents because they were the ones that put us on this path. So we need to give something back to our parents. And the only way of doing this is if we get the resources off the department. How to keep travellers in school is, like, I find it hard myself. Some people say to me, oh, why are you still in school? Because I want to be in school. And travelling children need to be tough themselves and stand up to their peers and say, that was your choice to leave school. My choice is to wait here in school. My choice is to go on and be a guard. Like, I know a lot of people say, oh, he'll never come a guard. I will fight. I'll have years to fight. I have till I'm 35 years of age to get into the Guards. And if I don't get into the Guards and I apply year in and apply year out, I can ask questions, why ain't I getting in? Because there has to be a reason why I'm not getting in. If I keep applying, I'm not getting in there. But these travelling children usually put in the effort first, but when they get knocked, there's no one there to bring them back up. And this is where, if the resources were in the school, a teacher can always walk over and give these kids a help. Like, if I fall, I have my homework club teacher to pick me back up. And it's great. Okay, my parents don't have the education to help me when I come home, but I have the homework club. And if there was more of these homework clubs put in place, traveller support groups and stuff like that, I think that we will see the census going up through the system. Travelling children do want to go up there, but they have no... They don't want to change their culture. They want to still live as a traveller, but we need to see the values of the education. Travelling people may stay in school, but when they go looking for job opportunities, they'll say, oh, he's a traveller, will we give them the job? I know I worked in hotels, I work in a nursing home now, as doing activities. I walked in there and I turned around and said, I'm a traveller. In the interview, I never hid it. It was up to them to give me the job or not. My cousin is a senior carer in there. She walked out of school at 15. She went back, she did outreach, and she went back, she had kids, and she came a senior carer now, and now she's going back doing nursing in September. So changes can be made, but the only thing that has to be done is the resources has to be put there. It's fair and well having the yellow flag and everything, that's great to have in the schools, but we need the resources in the classrooms to keep these kids in the classes. We have resources, like I know myself, I got resources. The whole way through up school I had resources, and then when Leaving Cert came, all these resources got taken away because I needed to have these subjects. There was no time to get these resources into my timetable, but I can always walk up to my year head and say, oh miss, in the PE class here today, I don't want to do PE today, I want to do extra biology or extra something, and this teacher will help me because they know I have the potential of going on, they want to see it, and travelling children need to, it's fair and well blaming the teachers of saying, oh, the teachers don't want to teach them, but a child has to put in their role too. It's a 50-50 road here. Children need to push and the teachers need to push to meet anything. In life, there's always two sides to the story, but you need to come to an agreement, and the agreement is the resources need to be put in and to keep these travelling children in school. And my big role models would have been my parents and the community guards. They kept me, because I seen them every day walking around, and I'd ask them the wrong questions. How did you get into the Guards? What's the requirements? I think when I was about 11, I knew the whole requirements of getting into the Guards, because I'd watch every guard passing out to come. I'd say, oh, I wonder, is there any travellers there? Because I want to get there. I wouldn't take any other job. I don't want any other job. I want to go into the Guards. I want to make a change, because we can see sometimes there's discrimination in the Guards. Some Guards may have it, some Guards don't. But I want to go in and show, okay, here's a person in the Guards that's from the travelling community, and I can go out and I can build links with travelling children we may see, or other children that's been disadvantaged, and I'm going to see, can I make changes in their lives and inspire them to keep going to school, keep going out and keep working. And the only thing I'm doing, education is the weapon of the life, I think. If you don't have education, you're going to find life tough, but like I see my parents, we got through life. But it's not in the 21st century. We can't sit back and just say, oh, we don't need education now. We need education for everything we need. Anything we want, we need the education. And the government needs to pull up, get the resources in place for these travelling children. Not just for travelling children, but for all children. There's no point just saying, oh, we'll give everything to the travelling children and isolate other children. We need to get it for all children, because it's not just because we don't know what's happening behind doors. It's very great to go in with a clean uniform every day and go in with a happy face, but what's inside us? We can all show off these happy faces, but what's inside us? These children may want to do well, but they may have to walk out of school for other reasons. And if the resources were there, I think travelling children and every other child do well. But the main thing is to get the censuses up and get these children in schools and keep them in schools for the best, for as long as we can keep them in school. Don't put any pressure because suicide may arise and stuff like that, but it's the main thing. Educate them, and when they're educated, it's up to themselves to make their own opportunities.
Good stuff, Ian. Yeah, thank you. Does anybody want to come back and ask Ian? Yeah,
Question.
go ahead.
When you talk about the homework club, because I'm just thinking of a kind of a group of homework clubs in a quite large community that I would live in, and the homework clubs are based, they would be run by like not an NGO but a service anyway, but they are on site, on the Halton sites and stuff. Is the homework clubs that you attend, is that a school run one, or is it a traveller specific one in a particular region? Because I know the ones that we have in Tallaght don't even actually have broadband, like, which is strange in this day and age. But so I'm just wondering, is it in school or is it run by an organisation or?
By the GRETB in Galway, so the Galway Roscommon Training Board. It's specifically for travelling children. It got established about 20 years ago. But it's sad because it took 20 years to get one boy to do his leaving cert. And there's another boy now coming doing their leaving. So the two of us we're not mostly friends now because we're killing each other for the pints. We want to see so we want to see the whole way up through, but when we get into 5th year and 6th year, it'll be head on, see who'll get the most. But like, it took over 20 years to get 2 travelling lads to stay there. Two graduates to get out there, and hopefully we will get more to stay in there. But I think if this is going to be taken away from our community, I'm sorry, but you're going to have no more other boys staying in education, because it's tough enough to stay there with the homework clubs. So imagine when the homework club is being taken away, you're not going to see these people in it.
And how many are in the homework club, please?
There's about 35, but it's mostly primary school.
Right.
It's mostly primary school. It's very few you'll see to get the leaving to junior cert, and then the homework club teacher. Like, I can email my homework club teacher any day of the week, any time, and she will help me. And that's the main thing. She's more like a mother when I walk in there. She's the mother of the education. That's what I call her. She's my mother when I walk in there, because I can turn around and say to her, I need help with this. And she's always, like, I haven't been in school, and I'd say, oh, I need help with biology. And she'd come in the next day with a big lump of biology notes. And I'm there. Before the teacher even opens up the book, I already know the topic. So it's these resources need to be done. But it's the teachers too. It's up to the teachers too to have a great inside of it. Like my teacher, she'll go a mile for us just to get us there. So I think...
Great. And can I ask you, sorry, just in terms of the 35 then, how big a geographical area is it? Like, do you have to travel far to get to the homework club?
No, it's up around the corner where I live in my house. It's about 5 minutes walk, not even less than 5 minutes.
And it would be the same for all of them? There's no barriers to transport in terms of...
No, like if there is one girl that comes from Knocknacar, but her mother brings her over to get her the homework club.
Great.
So you said it's ETB, so
yeah, the GRETB.
It's something maybe we should look to other ETBs to...
yeah, I know that Nessa and John, they had to actually get the train. I think it would have been interesting for them to listen to that, but it's something that certainly that we can bring up and investigate and see how the other, particularly the ETBIs, are dealing with it, because that seems to have been a real key focus in terms of supporting you, the homework club, which is great. Any other questions? Yes,
I actually missed Ian's presentation, and I apologise I had to go out to take a call. But just listen to there, and for the few minutes I got of it, you certainly are an inspiration, and to pay compliment to you and to your parents, and you obviously have great family support, and just to wish you all the best for the future, because I do think that you are a role model in your own right, certainly to the travelling community going forward. So wish you all the best.
Thanks, Senator. Okay, thanks, Ian. Really appreciate it. I think we're ending on a really high note. And keep in touch with us and let us know how you get on. And let us know when you're going to Templemore as well. Thanks, Ian. As there is no other business, this meeting of the Joint Committee is adjourned until 3:30 on Tuesday, the 9th of April.